There's a great deal of unnecessary confusion in American evangelicalism over the so-called pre-tribulation rapture. There is a great tribulation in the future, that is classical futurism. Jesus spoke of that in Matthew 24, referring to Daniel 12 verse 1. There's a time of unprecedented trouble, which certainly did not begin in 70 AD. If it did, this would mean that we have been in the great tribulation now for 2,000 years, and that is patently absurd. Those are days, Mark says, when it's tough for pregnant women and nursing women. That is evidently, self-evidently not true of 2,000 years. The Great Tribulation is not twice the length of the millennium. That's an absurdity. The Great Tribulation is a final agonizing burst of difficulty and extreme tension for the Jews and for the world. Now, there is a theory around since the days around about 1830 or so, when this idea was first advanced, that the Christians will be taken to heaven by a prior second coming. Thus, they think that there are two second comings, one privately, so to speak, to remove the Christians for 7 years, take them off to heaven. This is self-evidently false in Matthew 24. Can you imagine Jesus omitting to tell us about a complete resurrection of the faithful? Because that's what the theory implies. So the first thing in this discussion is always to invite your friends to speak of what they really mean, but don't say it. What they really mean is that they think there's a pre-tribulation resurrection rapture, a complete resurrection of the faithful 7 years before the public coming of Jesus to resurrect the dead. This is an impossible theory. Jesus did not leave it out. He doesn't mention it for 1 second in Matthew 24. He gives us the great sign, that's to say the abomination of desolation. When you see that, then you can know that the end is really upon us. When you see the abomination of desolation, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to, Mark 13:14, then you have to flee to the hills. Think about that for a moment. Nobody tells somebody to flee to the hills if they're going to be lifted off to heaven to be removed from that whole event. That is just nonsense. To be told to flee to the hills means exactly that. Get out of there when you see the abomination of desolation, quoting Daniel, of course, 3 or 4 passages in Daniel, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he, a masculine participle, Mark 13:14, ought not to. Head for the hills. No pre-trib rapture there. Nor is there in Paul. In 2 Thessalonians 1, Paul says that Christians are going to have to go on suffering affliction. They are currently being afflicted from various anti-Christian sources, and they're going to have to go on suffering that affliction until, and I quote, up to the point when the Lord Jesus Christ is revealed in flaming fire, taking vengeance on his enemies. That's not a secret rapture. Paul had not imagined a double second coming, a parousia twice over. So drop that from your scheme. Yes, Jesus does promise an escape for those who are faithful, who don't need to be, so to speak, tribulated, if I coin a term there, in that awful period of intense activity called the Great Tribulation. They don't necessarily have to go through that. Some will be martyred, Luke mentions that fact, but there is no escape to heaven 7 years before the end. There is a 70th heptad in the future, that's perfectly right, based on Daniel 9, particularly verse 26, where it says that the evil person will come to his end. A critically important translation of the Hebrew there, kitzo, his end, the end of the Antichrist will come at the end of that period of final tribulation. This will not apply to Titus in AD 70. That theory fails immediately. Jesus was not talking about AD 70. Yes, you can think of the destruction in AD 70 as some sort of type of the future, but he's referring to an end-time abomination of desolation, introducing a period of intense and unparalleled tribulation. Immediately after that, 24:29 of Matthew is the critical verse, immediately after that the sun will be darkened and Christ will come back visibly. This puts, of course, an absolute death knell, strikes a death knell to any Jehovah's Witness idea that Jesus came back in 1914 invisibly.